Hello, good evening and welcome to the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group's Roadshow. And in tonight's programme, not only will we have a question and answer afterwards, but myself and Alf Baird, Professor Alf Baird, who's way up north somewhere. Hopefully the internet will continue to work. We're covering basically Scotland, the media, culture and language. So I'm going to concentrate, first of all I'm going to introduce and give you a bit of a background into SSRG. SSRG is a think tank. It's been around for about 14-16 months. There's about 16 or 18 of us involved, including 4 professors. All have experience of either independence politics or other policy areas. SSRG is not here to tell you how Scotland's going to be independent or what an independent Scotland is going to be like. We're here to ask the awkward questions and to bring the experts together to give you the options of what it's going to be like. So we're not here to tell you how an independent Scotland is going to function. We're simply here to give you what we believe is the 6 most likely routes to deliver independence to begin with, and a snapshot of what Scotland's media could be like after we become independent. We were formed in December 2020, so we've been around for now over a year and a half nearly, and we meet every week and have very interesting discussions. We're not politically aligned with any particular party, and we're non-partisan, and we invite many guests to visit us and give us their input and their views on different aspects of independence. So we work with all parts of the independent movement, also political parties, and we've done 2 things that nobody else had done before we came along. We've now published, here's one we made earlier, like Blue Peter, the Treaty of Union. Prior to us publishing this, it was very difficult to find the Treaty of Union. All you could find was the Articles of Union, which is not the same thing. So not only will we now publish this, and there's several hundred being purchased so far, but we have a document library on our website, so you can visit us at scottishsovereigntyresearchgroup.org. That just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? And we did want to have SSRG, but somebody beat us to it, and I blame someone else for that. We are planning, obviously, a 3-day conference, which many of you may have already heard. Details of that are going to be announced, and tickets go on sale in the next couple of days, I understand. Some of the speakers are already announced and lined up. And also, we're producing a detailed online survey, so we'd encourage everybody to go onto the website when that's there and start filling it in. So, Treaty of Union, only available as a hard copy just now. We still have a few hundred left. Make a perfect Christmas present, order them now before stocks run out. So this is the sales pitch, just about ended, and a copy of that is £2 plus postage. Right, so we're here today to talk about media, culture and language, which are all, of course, linked. My name is David Henry, in case you didn't already know. I'm one of the panellists at SSRG, and our special guest tonight, who's remotely logging in, is Professor Alf Baird. He's also a member of SSRG, but has many other credits to his name as well. There'll be a Q&A at the end, so if you've got any questions, please put into the online chat a question mark, and we'll try and get as many of them answered as possible. So, I've already mentioned SSRG's conference is 29th to 31st of July in Dunfermline, and it's going to be jam-packed by the looks of it. I brought a quote up, which this recording will also be available on YouTube soon as a complete program, so please have a look at it, because you'll see the different camera angles and the graphic display as well. A quote from CMA, it says, which is Competition and Markets Authority, and they were investigating the monopolistic issues of Rupert Murdoch when he bid to try and buy all of Sky B. And so the Competition and Markets Authority actually said that if he was allowed to buy the broadcaster, satellite broadcaster, it would give Murdoch's family too much control over news and too much influence over public opinion. and the political agenda. That was deemed if he had 10% market share. So I'd ask you to think about other media organisations that have a larger share of market share, and whether or not you think that's acceptable. So the Scottish media currently, for what we would claim is the media, we have BBC One, BBC Two, which are both from the UK broadcaster. STV is a local service which is based on ITV. Channel 4, again, you'll be very well aware. They do have some regional commissioning, but there's not very much actual Scottish programming on Channel 4, and they certainly don't seem to have any news that comes from Scotland. But they do have a London-based news service. BBC Alba, then the BBC Scotland channel, which is only a part-time service, and of course we've got newspapers and radio stations, all of which, almost without exception, are owned by organisations outside of Scotland. Why have we got this? I don't know what that is. Start your video. So, I wanted to give you a little humorous thing before we get into a bit more depth. So this is what Scottish media could be like. I hope you enjoy it.
Good evening and welcome to Inept on BBC Shiteland, Scotland's hardest hitting politics programme. I'm your host, James McLafferty. Why is Scotland so shite? It's a question that's long perplexed scientists and Greek philosophers alike. Now we may have an answer. Meet tonight's guest, Dr. Alan Twatting from the University of Glasgow's Shitology Department. Good evening, Alan.
Good evening, James.
Doctor, can you tell us about your new research and break it down in layman's terms for our dumb as fuck audience?
Well, there turns out to be a new particle which saturates Scotland, and these particles are called shite particles.
Astounding. And what effect do these shite particles have?
Well, these are very negative particles that interact with existing particles and poison them to a degree, making the hosts of the existing cells stupider, incapable, and generally just excessively shite.
Earth-shattering revelations. How does this affect the political situation?
I simply can't see how Nicola Sturgeon can ignore this unbiased research.
Separatists often try to make comparisons between Scotland and other small independent nations.
This research obliterates those comparisons because we found no other trace of shite particles anywhere except Scotland.
So Scotland truly is unique in its shiteness.
Absolutely.
To play devil's advocate, not everything in Scotland is shite, even if those instances are extremely, extremely rare.
Well, yes, it seems like positive British particles from England drift over the border in clumps and manage to at least fight off some of the shite particles.
So this explains things like when Andy Murray wins a tennis match.
Exactly.
But on the flip side, surely not everything about separation would be shite, even if most of it would be.
No, we ran exclusive models on this. In the event of separation, the increase in nationalism in the consciousness of the population would massively increase the shite particles.
And what would the effect of that be?
It would probably rip open a portal into the dimensions of chaos and doom the entire planet.
Nicola better be thinking twice now.
Exactly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm playing a random audience member on Question Time in 20 minutes.
Thanks, Doctor. Join us next week for a 2-hour documentary with Glenn Campbell and comedian Susan Calman exploring why Scottish people are uniquely incapable of wiping their own arses. I'm James McLafferty. This is Inept on BBC Shiteland. Good night.
Of course, completely unbiased news there. Anyway, a little bit of humour, I thought. But now some key facts. In Scotland, 49% of all Scottish households or more now have a Netflix subscription. Linear TV in the UK now struggles to see its audiences get beyond 5 million on its main public service broadcasting networks. So clearly the audience has changed the way and what it views. The UK's TV licence is a tax, as everybody knows, levied whether you want to watch the BBC services or not. You don't have a choice. If you want to watch live TV, you have to have a TV licence. So the question I would like us to think about initially is, why is a PSB important? Well, a PSB such as the BBC or Channel 4 is required to provide a range of programmes and is quite tightly regulated to a minimum standard. Some of the PSB content is not the sort of content that a commercial broadcaster would be prepared to make itself, because it's not got an attractive audience, it won't make them very much money. And ultimately, commercial broadcasters are about making money. News, current affairs, children programmes are difficult to fund mainly because they have small audiences, but also for news and current affairs, few companies want to actually advertise in them. Scotland, therefore, I would argue, needs a public service broadcaster that is fit for the 2020s and not the 18th century. Scotland has no public service broadcaster provider. It only has a UK public service provider with local, nation and regional opt-outs. So Scotland has 2.51 million households. So the future funding, if the current TV licence fee was to be kept in an independent Scotland, would generate £394 million per year. So that's if every household paid the TV licence. I've done a little bit of comparison in Ireland, with RTE. RTE in Ireland has both a TV licence and sells advertising. It has a slightly smaller population to Scotland. Its annual income is €331 million, I believe, not pounds. It's broken down as follows. RTE has a TV licence revenue of €196 million and commercial income of €135.5 million. The last figure is available for 2020. RTE spends 90% of its content budget on homegrown programming, including Irish culture and including all their main live mainstream sports events. By comparison, the BBC Scotland channel has a budget of £44 million per year and is only a part-time service. Just 18% of Scots tune into it on a regular basis, according to the Baird data. So, the BBC Scotland channel has made no attempt, since it was launched a few years ago, to secure top Scottish live events or major drama imports. A Scottish PSB would be required to replace the BBC channels in much the same way as RTE did in Ireland. An independent Scotland would still have access to the BBC channels. Many people ask what would happen to your favourite shows. Well, if you have digital satellite, like a Sky platform, all the BBC channels are broadcast in the clear, free to air. So you could continue to watch, even though you're not paying a TV licence, because it's coming from a foreign country, which of course is England. So you would still technically be able to receive the BBC channels. However, they would be joined by the public service broadcaster channels. So in fact, there would be a bonus. You'd have extra channels to watch with no extra money to pay. So an independent Scotland could have an SBC and a BBC. Incidentally, in Ireland, the BBC services are also available. In Northern Ireland, RTE services are available. So they're both available in both countries. So it would appear to be quite logical that in an independent Scotland we would continue to be the same. So a Scottish PSB would be at the centre of Scotland's creative industry. We need to deliver original homegrown content, but it's up to us to decide what sort of broadcaster we want. If we follow the Channel 4 model, Channel 4 tends to commission all of its programmes from independent producers. So I would suggest that that is a model we should be looking at. But going back to my first point, when Rupert Murdoch was deemed to have too much power and influence if he was allowed to buy the remaining shares of B-Sky B, because he would have 10% market share in the supply of news and current affairs, what sort of percentage do we think the BBC has? Because I lodged a complaint about the BBC Scotland channel before it got its licence, pointing out that it had 46% market share in news and current affairs at the time, and the new channel would mean it would actually have more. So if 10% is too high for Rupert Murdoch, why is over 40% okay for the BBC? The issue here is no broadcaster should have too high a market share, because it gives them too much power to influence public opinion. So Scottish PSB would be required to commission a minimum amount of original content, and I would argue that content should be from, like Channel 4, a commissioning model, so therefore the majority of it is from independent producers. Then we have to bring back to the point where if we've got an independent production facility and industry and a broadcast that commissions it, then what sort of percentage do we think it's sensible for media ownership? Media ownership, as is a hot topic, especially when you realise that if it's owned by somebody outside of the UK or outside of Scotland, they may not even be paying tax here, and yet they can influence our politics, they can influence the content we receive, and in fact, if the content is making money, the money and the profit is going out of the country, not necessarily being reinvested in original content here in Scotland. So I would say that apart from discussing what sort of broadcaster and media we want in Scotland, we need to talk about ownership. Who is allowed to own the shares, and what percentage should be reinvested in original content. So a Scottish broadcaster should be there, such as RTE, to invest in all forms of Scotland's cultural and art. That includes film, television, online content, etc. That includes the Scots language, which rarely gets a mention. Gaelic programming, BBC Alba, of course, is again a part-time channel, but in fact has done little, if anything, to increase the use of the language. Mainly because I would argue that it was better off when there was programming on the main networks that were in Gaelic, and not being put into a little ghetto all on its own as a little secondary channel, which is of course what we've currently got. So there's much that an independent broadcaster could do. And I would also argue that just as it happens at the moment with the UK media, the UK and Ofcom and the UK government lists a number of important cultural national events, and that they have to be shown on free-to-air television channels. That only applies to games, football games that are from England. It doesn't include Scotland's games. As many of you that are watching this and in this meeting will know, that when you want to watch Scotland playing whoever it is, it's not available on STV, it's not available on BBC Scotland. In fact, you have to have a pay TV subscription to Sky Sports because Sky has bought the rights. No, they've only got some of it. That's for the... Yes. No, our national game is exclusive to Sky. Sky pays millions of pounds, and the Scottish FA did that deal, and yet people who have got normal TV, i.e. free to air, they can't watch their own game. In independent Scotland, that would not be possible if we did the same thing and listed those events as nationally important that the nation can watch without having a pay TV subscription. So all that is possible if Scotland is independent. At the moment, it's not. Now, I've looked at the television model, and as many of you will know, and as I mentioned at the beginning, more than half of Scottish households have Netflix. A vast majority of them now have other streaming services as well, whether it's Amazon Prime. So the world has changed and moved on. The BBC hasn't changed and hasn't moved on and doesn't really welcome the new world. They still want the TV licence. So we need to think what would be the future of Scottish independent television and a PSB. I would suggest, as I put up here, a future mixed revenue model in an independent Scotland. So that means we're not relying on one revenue source, such as the BBC with a TV licence. It could be a TV licence, or it could be a subscription. Commercial revenue, such as RTE has, which is television programme sales and advertising.
Progress.
So they have some of their revenue, almost half, coming from the commercial activities. A carriage fee could be possible from pay TV platforms and also broadband providers. Broadband providers, nearly every household now pays £20 to £30 a month for broadband. And if your public service broadcaster is producing news, current affairs, important programming, it's being streamed, it's being delivered via the broadband, then why shouldn't the broadband networks pay something towards the creation of that content? After all, they're getting a revenue stream because of that content, and yet they're not actually investing a penny in its creation. So I would argue that broadband providers and mobile networks and bandwidth providers in general could be asked to subscribe and pay something towards the content that their networks are benefiting from. And then there's another option, which would be a commercial subscription for business premises. If you can imagine, a public service broadcaster, call it whatever we wish, has the Scottish matches. At the moment, pubs and hotels would have to sit and have a subscription to Sky Sports, a commercial subscription, which is much more expensive than a domestic one. So there's nothing to stop a future broadcaster in Scotland from offering a different level of service for commercial premises to help them fund that content. And then, of course, Scotland as new public service broadcaster shouldn't be thinking small, shouldn't be thinking inwardly within its borders, it should be thinking worldwide. The Scots cultural language, an example, the global success of Outlander that has got millions of people watching all over the world in every country. If that was made and funded by the Scottish public service broadcaster, that could be an export, and that we could have a global worldwide streaming app for your Scottish public service broadcaster. People can subscribe anywhere. Think of it as a Scottish Netflix. So I would argue that there is plenty of upside when Scotland's independent and very little downside. Now, do European countries, apart from Britain, have news services? Well, strangely enough, they do. And some of them look much better than our one. So I've got a couple of little samples, and then I'm going to hand over to our Professor Alf Baird. So this is a German network, and it's completely different. What I also point out is their picture and sound and audio reproduction is vastly better than what we do in the UK.
Hier ist das erste deutsche Fernsehen mit der Tagesschau. Heute im Studio Klaus-Erich Bötzges.
Einen schönen guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren. Willkommen zur Tagesschau. Volles Haus heute im Bundestag in der Sonne.
We should be having some of their channels on our lineup. We should have German, English, Dutch, French channels available. Strangely, when you visit Europe, there are English language channels along with their own channels. In the UK, there is none of this. Digital satellite came along and it was meant to bring a whole brand new choice of channels, and actually all we got was 400 English language repeat channels. We got very little content from Europe. So I would argue that an independent Scotland should seriously think about offering real choice. So that was the Germans, and I wanted to end with a little bit of humour, which it should be humour, because we have a nice little bit from Nigel Farage, you'll be pleased to hear. So news from Ireland. Now, as I was saying earlier, RTE is a similar situation to where Scotland will be. Scotland is slightly larger population, a more wealthy country, and yet RTE produces a large amount of original content. Daily soaps, news, multiple radio stations, and they have a few commercial operators there as well. So I think this is quite a good model for us to look at. So this is, who could have guessed that with those facts, facts being brought up to him, he wants to blame everybody else. It's not anything to do with Brexit. I only used that little clip to show what type of news reports come from other countries, where I don't know if it's just me, but when I do watch the BBC, they go to great lengths not to mention Brexit, and therefore that's a broadcaster only a few miles off our coast, Ireland, clearly with a completely different view. So I hope you found that interesting, and I'm now going to hand over with the miracles of this technology. Let's hope it works, because it doesn't always. Over to Alf, if you can hear me.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. I hope you can see this graph coming up.
Not yet. Yeah, it's coming up now.
Theoretical framework.
Coming up now.
And can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
we can.
Is that a yes?
Yeah.
And you can see the screen. I just want to cover, to go through a few elements of what David was saying. I just wanted to cover culture and language in relation to independence, but also in relation to colonialism. I'll maybe finish off with a little resume, a brief overview of ethnicity as well. So this is the theoretical framework I developed since the referendum on which is intended to help explain the determinants of Scottish independence. So here I want to cover culture, language, colonialism and ethnicity. So let's remember that culture is our customs, beliefs, values, which are transmitted through language, and in our case, mostly through the English language. Cultural imperialism involves promoting the culture and language of one nation and another. And I would argue that is what Scotland is subject to. So Scots are subject to cultural imperialism, which enforces and reinforces what is in reality an alien cultural hegemony running Scotland. And this is also related to the theory of enculturation, Bourdieu's theory of enculturation. In our case, an Anglophone elite culture is imposed on Scots. And this leads, as we know, to what is a well-known condition. It's actually a psychological condition, the Scottish cultural cringe, which has another name, as I discovered in the scientific literature. But it basically leads to a feeling of cultural inadequacy and, in some cases, self-hatred. So what we have imposed on Scots really is what the singer Dick Gaughan explained as an illusion of culture, which, as we know in colonialism and imperialism, is a primary tool elites use to retain power. We have to remember here that culture and identity are very, very closely connected, as we'll see with language. And we have to remember also that Scottish independence is really dependent on, first and foremost, our national consciousness, which is based on our culture and language. So just to summarize here, we have the effect, if you like, of cultural imperialism, cultural colonialism, which creates a cultural hegemony running a country, which leads to a form of enculturation. Now, this provides a hierarchy of cultures within a colonial situation where you have a cultural superiority and a cultural subordinate, or what Fanon called cultural inferiorization. So you have different levels of culture within the situation we see. And this is what's led to the Scottish cultural cringe. So the Scottish cultural cringe is not a natural development. It's a development from colonialism and from imperialism. I have to say that the effect of this leads to what's known as internalized racism. We also have the illusion of culture, which we see on the media, as David explained, and this is one of the ways, the key ways a culture is presented and narrated to a people. But we have to remember the role of cultural imperialism and colonialism is cultural obliteration for the native culture, to basically destroy the native culture. And the aim, as well as cultural assimilation, we see particularly the middle class and bourgeoisie in this environment mimic the culture of the dominant power. We have as well what Dr. Harry Burns, the former Chief Medical Officer of Scotland, described in Scotland as a dislocated culture. And he discovered this related very closely to the state of Aborigine peoples around the world, marginalized peoples, marginalized because of their supposedly inferior culture and language. So we have what Professor Ailsa Henderson of Edinburgh University describes as a natural cultural inheritance, which is vital for nation building. So we really have to think about culture as being extremely important in the context of independence, which it's not been to the fore until at all, really, in the independence debate. And going back to Frantz Fanon, his conclusion is independence is ultimately a fight for a national culture. And that national emotion provides really a lot of the explanation for the divide in the yes-no vote. Moving quickly on to language, Indigenous languages form the basis of our national identity. Language and culture then intersect to create that identity. Language is also known as an aspect that defines and helps unite a nation. Linguistic imperialism seeks to marginalize and destroy Indigenous language. And let's remember that the Scots language is not taught to Scots bairns in the schools in Scotland. The Scots children are deprived of their language, which is a human right. The right to your mother tongue is well established under UN and Council of Europe regulations and rules and requirements. The aim of linguistic imperialism, i.e. monolingualism, teaching only English in Scottish schools, is basically what academics in the area describe as linguistic genocide or linguicide. The aim is to kill off a language. If you don't teach a language, it will eventually die off. So the removal of a language, in our case the Scots language and also the Gaelic language, is and was intentional. Loss of language really in that sense undermines our sense of identity and belonging to a nation. Language and culture are what give us our national consciousness, without which there would be no desire for independence in Scotland. That's how important language and culture are to Scots and to Scottish independence. Language policy in Scotland as part of the UK educational policy and the devolved department in Edinburgh is the same, is to deprive Scots of the Scots language, not to teach it and not to give it authority. We should also remember here that language is the most common rationale for self-determination of people, and also language provides basis of really the formation of an independence movement. So we should also, I think, further reflect that language, humans claim diversity via language, which defines identity. Language and culture forms our identity. Language determines our national attachment. The problem here in Scotland is the Indigenous language is not taught, and that's a typical imperial colonial policy, is to deprive a people, an ethnic minority, like in the UK context. And let's remember that the Scots are an ethnic minority within the UK, and we are deprived of our language, even by our own government or department of the UK government, as I would describe it. We have what Professor Tom Devine described then as a dual persona, two personas, which is basically a confused dual national identity, British and Scottish. The policy in Scotland is therefore maintained that Scots is not a valid language. Therefore, people who speak the Scots language are considered by implication to be invalid. This leads to what we know as ethnic or minority discrimination, according to the Council of Europe, reinforced as a policy of linguistic imperialism or linguicide. And its intention is to erode the sense of national identity of an ethnic minority, in this case the Scots, and undermines the sense of national identity and nationhood. The Gaelic Language Act of 2005 was implemented, but no, there has been no Scots Language Act, and one can only perhaps conclude that language was not perceived by the British establishment to be a threat to Scottish national identity because so few people actually spoke it. But Gaelic is not necessarily the language of most Scots, as we know. So the conclusion really is Scots are still deprived of their language. And this, of course, when they arrive to schools, the Scots bairns are basically very quickly made into Anglophones. The middle class in the imperial colonial situation, the bourgeoisie, mimic the colonizer to maintain social and economic privileges and benefits, and we see that particularly through the developments in private schools and elite universities, where most of our cultural hegemony comes from. We should also remember that most of the top positions in Scotland are advertised in the London press, and here there is no condition for knowledge of Scots language for anyone taking positions or senior positions with Scotland. The only language requirement is English. which does lead to many problems with people in different professional situations where Indigenous Scots speakers do have difficulty understanding certain other accents and languages. So the other aspect of here is this, going back to David's point about culture and in relation to the media, is we see reinforced here negative stereotypes of Scots speakers. Negative stereotypes in many different examples we could think about. The result really is a situation of what's known as colonial bilingualism. And peoples in self-determination conflict are always linguistically divided. We know that, whether that's Ireland, Quebec, Catalonia, Ukraine, wherever. We also know that there is significant demographic change happening within Scotland, with people coming in without the Scots language, without the Scots identity, which diminishes the possibility for independence in some respects. We do have a professional managerial class which is primarily Anglophone, and this leads to what Professor Michael Hechter described in his study, an ethnic and cultural division of labour within what he called the internal colonialism model within the UK, the UK being basically England and the Celtic periphery. That cultural division of labour leads to a cultural hegemony with a meritocratic elite, which is primarily Anglophone, leaving the Scots speakers, mainly the Scots speakers, marginalised and subordinate. Inequality in this sense, in the internal colonialism model, is therefore ethnically oriented. Here, self-determination, we should remember, reflects the ethnic solidarity of a people. In this case, the Scots people are form the ethnic solidarity of the independence movement. We should also remember from the post-colonial literature that linguistic underdevelopment of a people always parallels their economic underdevelopment. The Scotland we know today is largely underdeveloped. Infrastructure, resources, employment, GDP, everything is below par of what it could be with liberation of the people and nation to access their own resources for their own advantage and to lift up their own people. So we are a people, and we should remember here as well that a people without their language is a people without an identity. Once the people stop speaking the Scots language, which we are not taught how to read and write in, and not only about 30% of people in Scotland reckon they speak Scots, it might be a bit more, but many people in Scotland don't understand that there is a Scots language, and many do speak it, but they're not taught it. They're not taught to respect it, therefore, they're not taught to understand its literature, its meanings, its distinctiveness. And at the end of the day, language is there which unites a nation. So colonial inequality really is a result of this kind of situation: linguistic imperialism, cultural imperialism, and this is to a large extent linguistically determined. I'll quickly move on to colonialism. Colonialism, basically, well, we might start by saying that Scotland's enforced EU exit and successive blockages of independence, an independence referendum mandated by the people, demonstrate a rather colonial status. We'll do what we're told, in other words. But colonialism is basically political and economic exploitation and control. It can happen without settler occupation or other oppressions. So colonialism and imperialism is basically primarily external political control and economic exploitation. But my own research as well has found that settler occupation is a significant and, if anything, an increasing part of Scotland's situation. We also have in the UK context what we know of as internal or domestic colonialism. And this is basically how England operates running the Celtic periphery, according to Professor Michael Hechter's work and other research. In this, you have a cultural division of labour that favours the dominant culture and language, which is Anglophone. We have in the Scottish situation an economy that's largely developed and geared towards serving the needs of the mother country, which in this case is England. And therefore its underdevelopment is a reflection of that. The independence movement, as I said, reflects the ethnic solidarity of Scots speakers and therefore an ethnic group. And we're told by the SNP elite not to mention the ethnic aspect of independence, but it's actually quite central to the independence movement of any people and all peoples throughout history. So it's not something we can simply disregard. And the SNP elite seem to prioritize other ethnic minorities cases, but forget that the Scots are an ethnic minority group within the UK and an oppressed group, and that is the basis of the rationale for independence. In this case, independence can also be, as the UN describe it, as decolonization. And that's how the UN describe it, and they have a decolonization committee for those non-self-governing territories seeking independence. We should also remember from the post-colonial theory that colonialism is always a cooperative venture with the involvement of native elite groups. And we saw that, of course, in 1707 with the signing of the treaty by the parliamentarians and the aristocrats that sold out the nation and enslaved the people, basically. But we still have the same arrangement, a similar kind of arrangement today with a large elite class, if you like, mostly Anglophone, running Scotland. So these elites and the middle class are mostly oppose independence. Most of the people remain, or the bulk of the remaining people in the country remains in a relatively underdeveloped situation. Deprivation here in the colonial situation is linked to ethnic group, in this case, the Scots speakers. The colonial domination is dependent, therefore, on an elevation of an alien culture in this sense, which involves socio-linguistic prejudice, exploitation. And we have to remember that colonialism, because it elevates one culture over another, in this case, Anglophone culture, language over Scots language and culture, this involves what is in all cases of colonialism, which is racism. Racism is really at the root of colonialism, which is a situation we don't really talk about in the Scottish context. But language deprivation has serious psychological effects, as we might discuss later. So the school creates a permanent duality, if you like, the dual persona. The mother tongue is given no influence or authority. It's disregarded, it's discredited. But this bilingualism is a necessary outcome in colonialism, where the native participates in what is known as two psychical and cultural realms with different values. Two tongues are essentially in conflict. The colonized tongue has no stature or status. Jobs and education are linked to the superior language and status. The inferior language and status is more regarded as invalid. The mother tongue in colonialism speak is therefore crushed. The native bourgeoisie in this sense listen only to the colonizer. But in reality, English is a borrowed tongue for us Scots. Liberation of a colonized or a people subject to imperialism, liberation is about restoring their languages as much as anything else as part of their self-recovery, where the native has to find lost continuity and reclaim his rusted tongue and help towards the self-recovery. And even though the vocabulary might be limited, this is a reality in all forms of independence decolonization. I want to finish off with a couple of points about ethnicity. The Union itself has created what we know as the Scottish Cultural Code, but what the effect of this is actually a psychological condition, what I found in the literature on oppression, which leads to what is known as appropriated racial oppression, where a native people appropriate negative stereotypes about themselves and their culture, which is given to them by the superior culture, in our case, Anglophone. This leads to subordination and deprivation, which is considered by the oppressed group to be deserved, which is not, but that's how it's considered. And the oppressed group then devalue their own group and rebuke even people speaking in native tongue, Scots, for example. The patterns of thinking then support maintaining the status quo, which is basically cultural imperialism as a superior form of culture, as it were. And the oppressed group, especially members of the middle class bourgeoisie, seek conformity with the oppressor group culture. What is known in colonialism as mimicking the colonizer, to take his language, his culture, his values, and regard them as superior. Ethnic identity, of course, the native ethnic identity is destroyed eventually by cultural linguistic imperialism, what we might also regard as cultural assimilation or colonial assimilation. The hypothesis we might come to here in terms of the Scots who vote against their own independence, their own national citizenship, their own liberation, if you like, is that these are Scots people who suffer a high level of appropriated racial oppression as a psychological condition. And in that form, in that context, there is a scientific reason why people oppose independence. And this is important for the independence movement as a whole to understand, because although currency and pensions and other aspects of polity are vitally important, what we are fundamentally dealing with if this is a decolonization scenario is a psychological condition, which one has to be aware of. I just want to finish by mentioning that this has all been put down in my book, Doon Hodden, The Social Political Determinants of Scottish Independence, which is available from Amazon. And there is an article in Towson University, Journal of International Affairs, just been published, a shorter version of the framework on the social political determinants of Scottish independence, which covers all these aspects and more: culture, language, colonialism, ethnicity, and so on. And that's me, and I'm happy to take any question.
Thanks, Ralph.
Come on the screen.
I'm going to throw it out to have we got any questions. But I wanted to come back on 2 points that you've reminded me of. I've been to the Celtic Film and TV Festival down in Wales many, many years ago, 1999 it was. And I remember, I don't speak Gaelic, and I remember meeting somebody from the BBC, and over drinks, of course. And it turned out, I asked this chap, so what do you do? He had a very nice posh London accent. He went, oh, I work on Monarch of the Glen, which back then was a major BBC drama series, made in Scotland. But funny enough, all the crew was flown from London, so it didn't actually benefit anyone in Scotland. And I said, oh, right. So what do you do on this Monarch of the Glen? And he goes, you know, I don't understand what all this Celtic stuff's about. Yet we're at the Celtic Film and TV Festival. And I went, so what do you do on Monarch of the Glen? Oh, I'm the script editor. I goes, have you ever been to Scotland? No. Right. And so I had a bit more wine to drink. And, you know, I think I would be perfect as the script editor for EastEnders. And walked away and left them. But it brings me back to, in France, the French language is protected. Their media, they have very strict quotas of the minimum amount of French language media that there must be. So they've always, and this not just goes to their broadcasting and their media, they're also against American influences such as fast food. You never used to even get a McDonald's, you know, it wasn't allowed, it's frowned upon. It's not quite so much like that now, but they still protect their language and their culture, and they ensure that their media reflects their culture and language. And so an independent Scotland could very easily do the same. But all I would say is, just imagine if it was your Scottish broadcaster that was making Outlander and selling it to the world, and not an American TV cable network that was making it here, taking it away, selling it around the world, making all the profit. Oh, and it doesn't even get broadcast on a Scottish network. So there's a bit of an issue there. And two things you spring to mind. I can remember 2 BBC comedy series, and one of them I quite liked and thought was funny at the time. But when I look back at it now, I think Rabseed Nisbet wasn't exactly a great advert for Scotland, was it? And neither was Still Game. They're both taking the mick out of out of the Scots. Now, we may well be laughing at it ourselves, but actually we're laughing at our own culture and how, you know, we're poor and they're in housing estates and, you know, they're unemployed. Where's the successful stories? Where's the Scots that invented television, penicillin, built railways, where are they? Where's the positive images? It's an American cable TV network that makes it, and not us. And so I think, before we open it to questions, an independent Scottish media, when we're independent, would have to do something like the French does. We'd have to have a minimum quota for original productions, and it would have to ensure that all those productions had a minimum local crew. What is the point in commissioning programmes, and this is what currently comes, it's commissioned and the production is shifted to Scotland to be made. Therefore, it doesn't actually benefit anybody in Scotland because they don't employ anybody here. They brought all the equipment up from a higher place in London. They bring all their crew up from there. The writers based down there. The production office company is owned and registered in London. They might have a little satellite office in Scotland. It doesn't benefit the Scottish creative industries at all. So clearly we need a better model than that. So I'd like to ask if anyone in the room or anyone on our Zoom meeting has got any questions. Have you spotted any questions? You've got a question? Thank you. We have a question in the room and we have a microphone. I can't read. Yes.
I'm just picking up in the Scots language issue. During your presentation, you spoke in standard English with David. Now, I've been brought up to speak standard English in Scottish accent. I hardly know any Scots words. So, how do you then move to a situation where people in general are going to learn to speak Scots, the kind of Scots that perhaps ancestors have spoken 100 years ago? You're very eloquent, but you communicate so how do you then move to a situation where people like yourself, or academics, or especially what are then beginning to learn the languages from law?
Well, I think the simple answer is I've been speaking to my grandchildren recently about Scots words. Who's and Bunnet, they'll be lugs, and there's words. And I spent the last few years trying to write great pieces in Czech Scots. Recently I prepared something for the Salvo book for SSRG, which is Scottish Compact, the Constitutional Compact. I put that into Scots. So it's actually it's not difficult, really. It's taking your mind to put that difficult.
The whole syntax to it. It's not just about picking up words. It's about, my husband's family comes from Ayrshire, and the whole syntax and the grammar is different. It's not like English as one would expect. And I would think that part of elevating the culture is actually to have a more sort of formal lessons in Scots and looking at it as a language rather than just words which you can apply from some other language.
Well, that's what I recommend in the book Modern, is that Scots language should be taught to the Baird and the school up to higher level, and there should also be degrees in Scots language, and there should also be teachers in Scots in the schools. We have to teach the language to the people to let them understand that they have a culture, language, and identity that's not the one they're taught. Because we're all reactive, which is a culture feel as colonial mechanism make us think in that way
Your internet is letting you down a wee bit there.
It requires, and the Digital Language Act provided, it created a language board, so it gave the language statutory authority. It provided teaching in schools, certain Gaelic schools, up to higher levels. It provided money for Gaelic TV. It even created a TV station, BBC Alba, in Gaelic. Now, what we need is a Scots language equivalent to that. The cost of that, pro rata, I've estimated at more than £1 billion. That's what the government has to think about spending on Scots language. And that includes making sure teachers can teach Scots. Let's bear in mind as well, in many areas of Scotland, over half the teachers are not Scots. As David says, we don't elevate our own people into the best positions at all times. We often take people from elsewhere and give them the best positions, and that's because of language. The language we give authority to in Scotland is English. What we have to try to develop in Scotland is, like the Nordic countries, have an elite that stops speaking, if you like, for a change. All these countries are bilingual. They teach English as well as Icelandic, Norwegian, Danish, Swedish, Dutch, whatever. So bilingualism is normal, and so it's not an unusual thing. But the Scots are deprived of the language, and we have to understand that is for a particular reason. It's the colonial imperial reason that we don't have our own language. It's not inferior, it's a raw Scots language, it's a great European language, and it provides us with our identity. And as I said, in all the literature I've looked at, if a people lose their language, whether it's Aborigines in Australia or ethnic groups in North American Indians and so on, they lose everything. And they eventually lose their nation. You have to remember, in the colonial situation where you're suffering from colonial bilingualism, where your old language is deemed inferior, invalid, and you're using another language that's elevated and culturally, is that the people and their language and their culture eventually perish, as does the nation. So the Scottish nation will perish if we take the post-colonial theory, if we do not teach our language in the proper way.
Right, so can I just say we've got a question here in the room?
Yeah, David, so I was just going to ask, you talked a lot about what Scottish media could look like post-independence.
Yep.
But don't we, in order to gain independence in a way where we've got a really good popular support for it, don't we need to do something about the media before
we're independent? Yeah. Well, there's a number of routes that can be achieved. Clearly, online is quite easy now, and that is what I think one of the points I was trying to make is I was involved in broadcasting for a long time, and I like linear television. I learnt to speak like this, mainly because I was in London a lot, and I used to negotiate for film contracts with Hollywood studios. And it was quite funny that the Hollywood studios, with their UK division, CIC Video in particular, in Hammersmith, I would phone up to speak to their managing director to try and get this deal for Star Trek 4 and Top Gun, which I'd been negotiating for months. And they knew who I was without me even saying who I was. I said, "Hello, I'm looking to speak to so-and-so." "Oh, is that David?" I used to be, what? How on earth? This is before mobile phones. I used to have to send faxes, do letters in writing, faxes. There was no more email. I always used to wonder, how on earth do they know it's me? And she goes, "Oh, it's your accent." Well, I don't think I've got an accent. But anyway, yes, we could do something. To touch on what Alf said about how much it costs, I'm not sure about the £1 billion, maybe for everything, but I do know that the Scottish Government donates £12 million a year to MG Alba. It's MG Alba that provides all the content and funds all the content in Gaelic, which goes on to BBC Alba. I happen to think BBC Alba is a terrible idea. And a terrible idea because it's the BBC. So, I'll give you an instance. They spend about £1.2 million a year out of that MG Alba budget with the Scottish Premier League for a number of live football matches. And that's about the only programme, that and some music programmes, that rates at all and gets any audience. And it gets quite a sizable audience. The problem is, because it's a BBC service, that doesn't benefit the channel at all. It's a fixed budget. So even though it may get 50, 100,000 viewers watching that live football match, Hearts versus Rangers or whoever it happens to be. It makes no difference because it doesn't bring in any extra money to the channel to be reinvested in content. If that had been a commercially funded channel with advertising, the bigger the audience, the more money you make, the more money you have to put back into content. That's the Channel 4 model. So I would say that the Scottish Government could, even with just some small stimulus, help, let's say, a YouTube-based channel, which is in the Scots language. The world has moved on. We do not need a linear TV channel like BBC Alba, which shuts down at midnight every night anyway. We could create content and put it in a place that people could watch it. And I happen to think that you generate interest in a language. I mean, that's why I told a little story about going to the Celtic Film and TV Festival and found it so interesting that the person that was editing the script for Monarch of the Glen, a huge BBC drama at the time, so-called Scots drama, had never been to Scotland and knew nothing absolutely about Scotland or the Celts or anything and didn't understand any of it. Well, how the hell is he qualified to be editing the script?
It was an English language.
Well, it was in English, so it was an English language version. Now, I happen to like Downton Abbey. I think it's great. Of course, it's a fantasy. And I would like to know what the people that lived downstairs really thought, rather than the fabulous drama. However, for you to gain interest and get people interested in a language, you have to have something of interest for them to watch or listen to. BBC Radio Scotland could easily come up with a series of plays in Scots language, you know, and that might, rather than having the Archers, which I can't stand, or any of the rest of the nonsense that's on Radio 4, when you switch off UK media for a while, which I have done, and then you go back and you delve into it and have a little listen, you think, my God, I never realised how much I was being brainwashed into their view of our country. So we need to, yes, we need to look at doing something now, but on very modest. So I would say radio is the way to go. Radio plays are quite cheap to produce and make and record. Somebody could be doing that, and they could be put on the streaming services and podcasts, and you could be listening to it. So when you think about it, I can't think really of anybody that's got a lot of social media following, that supports independence, that's got a big audience, that isn't speaking in English. So I think Alf is correct. And I mean, I'm a perfect example of this. If it was up to me, I would have BBC Alba as a commercial station, not a BBC station, so that it can benefit from extra income, so it can increase its audience and its revenue. But I would make it so it was in English. I find it impenetrable to watch football when the commentary is not in English. And technically, you can have two sets of soundtracks with any channel. It's the one thing I found in France, as I was saying earlier to Jeff. When I was in France a few years ago on the border with doing the Geneva Motor Show, this hotel had the TV, right? And there was an American series on it, and I couldn't understand a word it was done because it was all dubbed into French. And I thought, but this is an American show, it's in English. Then I found out that you can change the language on the TV if you can learn what the word is in French. Anyway, so I changed the language, and I changed it to the original language, because all across Europe, there's two sets of languages being broadcast. The original language, which is an American series, so it's in English. So I reprogrammed every French TV I came over into English. And I'm pretty certain I wasn't very popular at the end, especially since they don't know how to change it back. So there was some more questions, I understand. Online?
Yeah, well, a couple of comments have come in through the Facebook, especially when we're having the conversation about the media, and I see all the reactions on the live stream. So I think you on radio and linear TV, I think consumers are changing their demographics. They're switching to taking the content they want when they want it, as you said, with the things like Netflix. And when I'm just flashing back to when you were talking about the TV show that we did in America about Scotland, and ironically, it didn't broadcast in Scotland until after the independence referendum in 2020.
Outlander.
Yeah, and that was due to
interference.
Prime Minister David Cameron the day literally getting into that studio saying, you can't put this in there, because we didn't want to see the breakout effect.
It's not what he said though. I actually have that email. if somebody remembers Sony Pictures Television, their email system was hacked and somebody downloaded all their emails. Well, that was quite helpful because I was been looking for somebody at Sony Pictures Television's phone number. I managed to find it, funny enough, in one of those documents. But in fact, what David Cameron told them, it would be unhelpful if this was broadcast in the UK. Now, it has since the first season, I think, and maybe the second season, went out on more for.
Yeah.
However, got hardly any promotion. So, yes, they were allowed to buy it, license it, but in fact, they weren't really allowed to promote it. Clearly, that's the situation we're in.
Picking up another question
Yeah.
came from the actual feed. Kevin's asking, why is the licensing authority scared to produce a public private network TV channel in the UK?
I'm not sure they're scared. You have vested interests. I mean, I've sat in a room with, there were Channel 4, ITV and BBC people there. And their argument for, they didn't want anything to change, of course. They were all quite happy with the way everything went. There was some review into the TV license, and I remember feeding into that. One, I think there's two things wrong with a TV license, which is makes it a criminal offence not to have one. And therefore you're being forced to, in this day and age, to pay for something you might necessarily not want. And also it encourages the BBC to interfere in every segment of the market, whether it's radio, internet, launching new TV channels. Did we really need a BBC Scotland channel? No, of course we didn't. And in fact, hardly anybody watches it. It's 18% of Scots tune into it on a regular basis. So it's been a disaster. Now, before it was launched, there was another channel called STV2, which I had a following and an interest in, because I believed STV2 could have been a proper Scottish independent channel. STV wanted to sell it and get rid of it. However, that could have been the start of a Scottish channel and done Gaelic programming and gone after sports events. It is perverse that we are fed on STV England's live football matches. Yet our Scottish live football match we can only watch if we've paid Sky TV for Sky Sports, about £40 a month. That can't be right. Why is the English match available free to air, but the Scottish match isn't? Because Ofcom controls that list, and that list is only what they deem as the important games for culture. And as far as they're concerned, that's England. We're just a tiny little offshoot. So it comes down to, where do we go from here? Well, a couple of the ideas. You've got script writers, you've got actors out there, a little bit of seed money, start making some programming that people want to listen to. You say about, I happen to think things go round in circles. So don't rule out television. People have said television is dead. Well, funny enough, people are watching it more than ever before. They're just not watching the BBC. They're instead using it for Netflix, using it for Amazon Prime. And while it's great to say people are selecting what they want to watch, but that's because somebody else gave you that option to watch it and put it there. The people that create the content are making the decisions for you. What the BBC used to be very good at, and this is what we need to be thinking about, is you used to watch, and I certainly used to watch a lot of BBC Two as a child. So I watched Horizon, I watched Panorama, and I learnt an awful lot of things I knew nothing about before, and I found it by accident. Tomorrow's World was one of my favourite shows. You know, I mean, technology, etc. Always that. They were wrong on everything, of course. They predicted just about everything. It always was wrong. The paperless office, remember that? How did that work out? But by having general entertainment channels with mixed content, a public service broadcaster that isn't driven purely by profit, i.e. the maximum audience, there's your problem for Netflix. If it's only going to be stuff that's popular, and I remember hearing and was horrified at the head of Discovery Networks at the TV festival in Edinburgh, an American woman, saying that they make more of what you want. Shark Week is the biggest thing they do around the world, so they're making more of it. Wow. So we'll be experts on sharks, but nothing else. So this is the same, I mean, that's a human being making those decisions. But your algorithm that reinforces what you've already selected, what you already like, means you're going to get more and more of the same stuff that you already know. So you're actually going to be dumber and less, and you're going to learn less, because you're not going to get anything other than what you already select and want to watch. I use it all the time on YouTube. Love planes. I've seen every plane crash program ever was. I can usually predict why this one's going to crash before I've seen the end, because I've seen that many of them. So they should just hire me. They don't need this national board to come and investigate. I'll tell them what went wrong. You know, but it's the same thing being fed to you over and over again. So while I like Netflix, it's not a replacement for a public service broadcaster. It's not going to make content in your language if it doesn't think there's enough people going to pay for it. So I come back to, I think Alf is correct. We need to be thinking much more broadly. This isn't just about broadcasting. It's about media, it's about our culture, it's about talent, and it's about producing stuff homegrown. But a new broadcaster needs to be not following the old model. We need to be everywhere, on everything, and available. And what better way, instead of it being the Stars Network funding Outlander, and it happened to be the Scottish broadcaster that did it, and that's our top show that's available globally on our paid subscription app, and you can watch it anywhere. Why not? If they can do it, we can do it. It's made here. The people that are making it are based in Scotland. The main actors are Scottish. So if we've got all this talent, how come we're not funding it? So I would. That's where I think I would leave it. Is there anybody else with any more questions before we wrap up? Because we've got to get out here fairly quickly.
Nothing from the room. A lot of comments. So obviously we'll try and feed as much back of it through. Thanks very much to both Alf and yourself, David.
Thank you.
It's been thoroughly enjoyed, and thanks very much.
And let everyone know we've got our conference at the end of July for 3 days. There's going to be a panel on Scottish media and culture there, with some other people feeding into that. So if you can come along to that, please do. But also, what was I going to say? My last point. Oh yes, we're putting this. This is being recorded at the moment. So even though you haven't seen via Zoom everything, you will be able to see everything that was actually recorded. So hopefully that'll be up over the weekend. You'll be able to find it via YouTube. And any comments, please do come back. And we've got another thing next week up in Perth, which is about Scottish defence. Apparently we're not going to be defenceless after all. I'm not sure it's going to include nuclear weapons. Anyway, not for me to decide. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us.